Thanks, Alex. So I do want to let you know that the meeting is going to be recorded, just the part where I'm presenting. Once I'm done presenting, then I will have the recording turned off, and then we can actually have some discussion. Thank you all so much for taking the time to come to this session and engage in talking about imposter syndrome, which is something that affects a lot of folks. I venture to say that pretty much all PhD students are going to experience that at some point, everybody in academia, and then, even outside of academia, lots of people experience that. But I think it's really, really rampant in academia. So that's why I think it's really important to talk about it. So I'm going to share some slides with you, which, just like always, I will share after the meeting. And I should also, just in case you don't know me, introduce myself. My name is Emma Anderson. I am the Director of Inclusive Education and Teaching Support here at CICS. And I'm really invested in making it so that everyone who is in our program is able to do the best work that they can do. And part of that is talking about some of these more emotional issues, which are a big part of who we are as humans. So this is a part of a 4-part series. And next week, we have one more session, and we'll be talking about time management and boundaries. Okay, so today we're talking about imposter syndrome. So a quick definition of imposter syndrome is that feeling that you are a fraud or unqualified for the work you're already doing, that you're faking it and you might be found out at any moment. Or even if you're not a fraud, you are certainly less good or less qualified than your peers in similar classes or situations. So just this nagging feeling that somebody's going to find you out, that you shouldn't really be here, that you're just not good enough. How could you be good enough? Why would someone pay you to do this thing that you spent years learning how to do? That kind of thing. All of those things come into imposter syndrome. And later in this talk, I'll also talk about your inner critic, which is sort of another way to look at imposter syndrome. So 2 articles that I use heavily in figuring out what to talk about are this blog post from MIT called "Picture Yourself a Stereotypical Male," and then the article that she points to, which is "Where Are the Gender Differences? Male Priming Boosts Spatial Skills in Women," which comes out of University of Berlin from 2008. I don't love the title of that article, but I'm going to explain what it means, because I think that at the root of talking about imposter syndrome is but prove to me that I am good enough, because my brain says I'm not good enough. So I'm going to use the example of gender and spatial reasoning. I think it's pretty common knowledge that people think that men are better at spatial reasoning than women. And there have been a ton of studies done trying to figure out why this is. And they've looked at cultural differences, like people in different countries experiencing this differently. And they're like, well, okay, well, if women in certain countries were able to perform just as well as men on these tests, then there must be some cultural difference at play. Or maybe it's testosterone levels, or maybe it's this kind of brain development or that kind of brain development. Well, these folks, Ortner and Sieverding, instead of looking at what innately makes women less good at spatial reasoning, said, well, what if it's a nurture thing? What if it's something we're being taught? And I'm going to go back actually and explain what the experiment was that they did. So they had a spatial reasoning test, which is basically having a 3D shape and asking someone to rotate it in their mind and imagine what the other side would look like when you're looking at on a 2D space. And they had 4 groups. 2 were made of women and 2 were made up of men. And in each group, like when you divide them in 2, we had 2 groups within each of those. One was primed female and the other was primed male. And what I mean by that is to be primed female is to say, okay, picture yourself as a stereotypical woman. You are waiting for your husband to get home from work. You are cooking a meal. You are, like just describing the daily occurrences of this stereotypical woman. So imagining ourselves in this state. And then the other group, primed male, was, imagine you are a stereotypical male. You are going out to work. You are earning money for your family. You are coming home at the end of the day and your wife is waiting for you. And I actually don't know what the text was that they used for the priming, but this is the kind of thing that was involved. So what were the results? Well, women who were primed female had a mean between 0 and 9 of 3.86, whereas men primed female had a mean of 5.14. So that's a huge difference. But when the groups were primed male, there was almost no difference. Women primed male had a score of 5.49. Men primed male had a score of 5.53. So what this tells us is that women who are reminded of their stereotypical identity are going to underperform by quite a lot. And men who are reminded of a stereotypical identity that is not theirs aren't going to underperform because they know at the end of the day, they're still all good. And women are being reminded of this thing about them that is, in the media is not a good thing. But they have that ability. So for us to say, oh, well, women aren't good at it. Okay, well, we've just shown that women can be good at it when they're not primed to remember all of these like stereotypical things. So I just want to give you this preface to talking about imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome affects marginalized communities much more than other communities. And it's not just women in STEM fields. It's folks of color, it's people with disabilities, it's queer people, whatever that marginalization, like that is acting on us. So maybe you feel like an imposter because people are treating you like one, because there are those stereotypes out there. So maybe sexism or racism or ableism is saying that you can't possibly be good at what it is you're doing. Stereotypes are super, super rampant in our brains, and they just like bite down with all their teeth. And people forget facts that don't fit the stereotypes that they already had. So let's say that you grew up really poor and you are in a computer science class and you ace the first test and you're like, wow, that's pretty cool. And your friends are like, man, that's cool. Nice work. I'm surprised. You're like, oh, well, that sucks. But then we take the second test and you do well again. And your friends are like, no way, really? That's awesome. I'm surprised that you did that well. You're like, dude, I just aced the first test. What? But this is like a stereotype that people feel like you have to prove it again and again and again if their stereotype doesn't match how you're doing. Also being advised to lower your ambitions. I think this happens a lot of times. I give the example of our undergraduate program. We have 2 data structures classes. There's like a lower one, 186, and a higher one, 187. And a lot of women get talked into taking that lower class, 186, because, oh, the other one is really hard. Anytime somebody's like, oh, well, that class is really hard, are you sure you want to take it? Like, that can be a sign of a stereotype being at play. And also people assuming that you got where you are because you were a diversity candidate. Like, oh, well, the only reason you have this internship is because you're Hispanic. Or the only reason that you got this job is because you're a woman or because you're Black or whatever. Those are all these like little stereotypes, these little microaggressions that are feeding our own imposter syndrome. And I do want to point out that we see it working the opposite way also for folks who are Asian or Asian American, sometimes with math or computer science ability, struggling. And there's a stereotype that like, oh, well, Asians are so good at math. So if you're having a hard time and that's your identity and people are like, but you're good at this, right? You're supposed to be good at this. And that can also play into that imposter syndrome that, okay, well, I don't fit the stereotype, so I must be an imposter. So it works in a lot of different ways. I'd say that folks who are marginalized in the US are going to experience it at higher rates, but it doesn't mean that everyone is not experiencing this. So I want to talk briefly about something called stereotype threat. This also comes from the Picture Yourself a Stereotypical Male article. And my link didn't show up quite well, but she references a great 1995 article by Steele and Aronson, The Stereotype Threat and the Intellectual Test Performance of African Americans. So they're defining stereotype threat as the risk of confirming stereotypes about a group that you belong to, which can lead to fear or academic underperformance. So that fear that you have in the back of your mind that if I do poorly on this test, then I am just going to confirm that students who look like me do poorly. Or if I don't show everybody that they're wrong about my stereotype, then I have failed in some way, that I am representing everyone in my group. And so again, this is the test that they did in this article is one of priming. So they had a diagnostic prime and a non-diagnostic prime, and they were giving SAT questions to Black students and white students. So the diagnostic, the prime was, because we want an accurate measure of your ability in those domains, we want you to try as hard as you can to perform well on these tasks. At the end of the study, we can give you feedback, which may be helpful by pointing out your strengths and weaknesses. So basically saying like, this test is going to tell you like how good you are. The non-diagnostic, and remember, these are the same test questions, says, even though we are not evaluating your ability on these tests, we want to ask you to try as hard as you can to perform well. If you want to know more about your performance, we can give you feedback at the end of the study. So this is, we're not evaluating you. This is just like for you to know more about yourself, and you have the option, you have the ability to find out more. So those were the two different primes, and this is what happened. So the scale is number of items answered correctly. So under the diagnostic, white students overperformed, Black students far underperformed. On the non-diagnostic setting, they performed exactly equally. So this is telling us that like these cultural cues around us, anything that someone is telling us about what it means to be who we are and how our academic performance relates, that's really going to affect us a lot. So I show you this kind of to nip stereotypes in the bud. I've been giving you two kind of like stereotype myth debunking studies to sort of remind ourselves that like, yeah, stereotypes exist, but they're insidious and they're not doing us any favors. So it seems like I've given you like a ton of bad news at this point, right? Like stereotypes are rampant. We all have imposter syndrome. Everybody is struggling. What are we going to do about it? So I have three things that I want to encourage you to do. to combat stereotype threat and imposter syndrome. Talk about it with others, because that's been proven, and I can give you that study link when I send this out again. It's been proven that that alleviates stereotype threat, particularly just being aware of the fact that it happens and being aware that we're not alone in it. Using data to prove or disprove your inner voice, and using self-talk. So first of all, you're not alone. We should be talking about it. And I have some quotes that are from professors here at UMass and CICS that explain that like everybody feels this way. Some of these are a little bit about failure. Others are about imposter syndrome. So I'll just read them out loud. The first one, the machine learning system that I constructed for my MS thesis was initially a spectacular failure. A couple of months before the end of the semester, and my parents and in-laws had both already made travel plans to attend my MS graduation, and then my apparently on track thesis disintegrated before my eyes. Another professor says, I had a hard time transitioning from being a student good at following directions to a self-directed researcher. No one really tells you how to do this, and depending on your personality, setting your own agenda might not be a comfortable or natural act. Furthermore, I felt like a lot of peers just seemed to know how to navigate graduate school in ways that seemed foreign to me. So at the base, being an imposter in graduate school. And the last one, I graduated with 0 publications and only ever did get 1 from my thesis. I got the degree, but never really felt I deserved it. Very little of my research ever bore fruit, and I was left feeling I didn't know how to choose problems or even really do research. I want to tell you that the last quote comes from Laura Haas, the dean of our college, who has 30 years of research experience in industry. This is someone who is incredibly accomplished and who still feels this way. And I tell you that's not to tell you that like, oh my God, it's never going to get better, but to say that you are not alone. And this may always follow you, but the more we talk about it, the easier it's going to get. Point 2, using data. I promise you that there is real evidence out there that you are equipped to do what you do. Find it and remind yourself of it when you need it. So one thing that I do is to make a document that like exists on my computer with every nice thing someone has ever said to me. Every time somebody sends me an email saying like, oh my gosh, you saved my life. I think that you're such a skilled facilitator, et cetera, I just copy and paste, put it in that document. And then when I need to remember that I am actually equipped to do my job, that I don't deserve to be fired, that I deserve to be paid well, I go back and read it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm awesome. All these people know I'm awesome. It doesn't matter if like that only happens like once every 3 months that somebody sends me something nice. It's in there for me to read. And then another thing you can do is, this is particularly good for if you're applying for a job and feeling like, oh, I don't deserve to be here. Make a list of 10 things that show you are just as qualified as anyone else to do the thing you're doing. And if you're having trouble as a grad student, like make that list too. Like, do you have a bachelor's degree? Sweet. Have you done research? It doesn't matter if you're published, doesn't matter if it was like successful, quote unquote. Research and success that's very nebulous. Have you been a TA before? Do you know how to have a conversation with someone about your research? Like, these are all things you can use. There are all these different ways that you can be qualified to do what you're doing. So make those lists and convince yourself. It's like writing a proof for your own credibility. And it's true that sometimes you might be a little out of your depth. And it's okay if you like have that data and you're like, wow, it seems like I am being ranked at the bottom here all the time. Huh, maybe I need to investigate that. Whenever I do this talk, people always ask me like, okay, well, what's the difference between feeling like an imposter and like actually just like being bad at everything? And I would say that data is going to tell you that you're not bad at everything. You may struggle with this one thing that you're experiencing, and there are ways to get through that struggle. But most of the time, you can find data that you're actually pretty good at it. And then the last one is to use self-talk. So something that I use myself is there is a voice in my head that tells me that I am terrible at everything. And sometimes she gets really loud. Her name is Noreen. She's a real asshole. And it helps me sometimes to identify that that's who's speaking when I'm hearing those thoughts. But it's not real. She's sort of a figment of my imagination, but she feels real to me, but she's not based in reality. She's just like based in like making stuff up. She only listens to stereotypes. She only listens to like the bad stuff and then repeats it back at me. So if I can tell myself that that's who's talking, it's a little easier to understand what's real and what's not real. And then on the other side, give your self-confidence a voice. Affirm yourself out loud and using your name if you can. Emma, you are really good at your job. You are a pretty awesome person, Emma. Apparently Kobe Bryant does this in the mirror. Or no, sorry, LeBron James. That's who it was. LeBron James does it in the mirror. A lot of famous people like do affirmations to work on their self-confidence. And it's a little hokey, might not work for you, but it can really help just to like say those words. And then the last point that I want to make is that we're all struggling. We're all struggling with something with our self-worth. Even those of us who seem like they are the most outspoken about like being the best of anything, we're all struggling. So be kind when you can. Compliment others whenever you can, because they probably have a document that they're saving all their compliments in, and wouldn't you like to be quoted? And be open and vulnerable about your own imposter syndrome. Those are ways that we can collectively work through this kind of thing together. And then I would also be remiss if I didn't speak to the fact that like sexism, racism, and ableism are a huge part of all of this. Classism as well. And the more we can fight against those things in whatever work we do, in our own minds, through social justice, like those things are also going to combat imposter syndrome for everyone. So even though this is like your own work, maybe about your own imposter syndrome, to do that work to be anti-racist, to be feminist, to be anti-ableist, and support all people and learn about how these structures can really mess with us. That can be really important. So that's what I got. And oh, this is the button I need.